the biggest town between Johannesburg and Cairo. Founded less than 60 years ago as a small depot on the railway, Nairobi today is the commercial and industrial center of East Africa. A modern, progressive city with broad streets and tall buildings. It has a mixed population of over 200,000. Africans and Indians share its amenities.
In 1958, the first 5 people came here, and in 2 years' time they decided what to do. And what to do was precisely to fill the gap that existed at the time between ordinary level education and university, with an advanced level college, which was Strathmore at the beginning.
The founder of Josiah had an idea of university, but when the people came here, they saw that what was really needed was an A-level college which would offer courses, post-secondary courses, to Kenyan students. Because after secondary school, students who wanted to continue with A-level and university had to go to Kampala, to Makerere University, to study A-level and then university.
Because there was no advanced level given to African students. There were schools for Europeans, there were schools for Asians offering advanced level, like St. Mary's, like Prince of Wales, which is today Nairobi School, like Duke of York, today Lenana. These were given advanced levels, but the others were not. When the idea of Strathmore was mooted, you're talking about 1958, 59, very quickly the people realized, I wasn't here yet, that there were not 1 but 3 ministries of education. There was a minister for European education, a minister for Asian education, a minister for African education. The financing was different, the personnel was different, the philosophies were different, etc. So if you wanted to open something for the 3 groups, you were sent on a wild goose chase. One minister would send you to another, and you never got anywhere. The man who understood this was, I think, the last of the European Secretary of Education, a man by the name of Matheson. And he realized that to solve the problem, you had to have a special law passed in the Legislative Council, the pre-parliament, let's say, there was no parliament in colonial times, to allow this. And they did. They passed a special law that made the staying together legal.
So that was the proper solution. An A-level college, interracial, interdenominational, etc.
The day I arrived, where we are sitting down, there was only a hole in the ground. Literally, the foundations had already just been dug, but construction had not yet begun. It began and finished in 8 months or so time. Those 2 of us who came together, David Sperling and myself, we had not known each other before. We met in Rome, and we were preparing things together. I didn't know a word of English at the time. My instruction in school was French, because I knew Latin and Greek, but for modern languages I knew French. I had started studying English, but you don't go very far if you don't speak the language. So what happened was that we went to the British Embassy to fill forms. And he said, you don't worry. He says, I fill my form and you copy it. So he filled this form and he gave it to me, and I was startled when I realized that his date of birth was the same as mine. I didn't say anything, I just copied it. So he said, no, you copied the wrong thing. That's the birth date. He said, I know. And that's also my birthday. That's how we found out. So ever since, we celebrate our birthdays together. We left Rome together. We got, thanks to a friend who had contacts, we got passage for 2 people for the price of 1 ticket. So we were traveling on a shoestring. We didn't have any money with us. And we left Brindisi in southern Italy. When was it? Yeah, in mid-July 1960. From there was 3 days of navigation across the Mediterranean to Port Said. Then 1 full day across the Suez Canal, which is 170 kilometers long, to Suez. Then 3 days, the Red Sea. The Red Sea is very long. Doesn't look like, because it's narrow, but it's long. And then the 4 last days of the Horn of Africa down to Mombasa. There was no port in Mogadishu at the time. So the ship stopped at Mogadishu but didn't dock because there were no docks. So the passengers who alighted there were brought on boats by canvas baskets, put in baskets and shipped over the boats, and then they went. And then we arrived 3 days later. We were, some people were waiting for us at Mombasa. I was most impressed by the custom officers, who were all Indians. And the thing that impressed me most was how they were Sikhs, how they drew their beard inside some kind of mask, like the one down of the COVID, and the hair also inside the turban. This I didn't expect. I never saw anything like it. You won't believe this, but in 1960, 60 years ago, we arrived in Nairobi in 6 hours flat by a Volkswagen Beetle. Nairobi was nowhere near what it is today. Today, all these obstacles and razor wire and defenses and high walls did not exist. You had the free entry into anybody's house. But there was no security. The things began to deteriorate years later. Kevin was a structural engineer. Ed was an architect. They had a studio on the other side of St. Mary. There is a complex today known as Kenindia Gardens, which is enclosed, which was bought all by the same people. In those days, there were separate houses. They had the studio in one of those houses. And they just drew and drew day and night. So they combined the 2 skills together and did that. I had a little training as a draftsman. I copied one of the drawings myself, but my experience was not too much, so that did not last. They managed to finish in time, and then the disaster struck when the chapel was being built, because one of the contractors removed some of the supports to the roof to install some machines. And when the weight of the cement began to increase, it was a continuous casting of 72 hours, the corner collapsed and the whole roof came down. That retarded the construction by 10 months. I didn't teach anything because I couldn't speak English. So what I did for the first 2 years was occupy myself with the accounts. I was the first bursar. One thing that I still remember from that is the instruction that were written down in a cyclo-styled maybe 8 or 9 sheets of paper, size A4 more or less, where it gave you the instruction on how to keep accounts to the trial balance stage. I read them, and I did, and I followed them. It was only later that it struck me how professionally and how clear those instructions were. And I looked for them everywhere, I couldn't find them again. But from knowing nothing about accounts, by reading that, it made me in a position to keep a trial balance account for 2 years. From the beginning here we have had people of all stocks and colors. I don't use the word race because that word has never been defined either scientifically or philosophically. There has never been here a problem of living together. In fact, in some of the old drawers of the old residents, you still find the names of the students who were there living and who wrote the graffiti, so to speak. Okay? So there was never any clash due to diversity. One thing that struck the students more than anything else was the fact that in the dining room there was no special table for the teachers. The teachers mingled with the students. That struck people very, very deeply because I've never seen anything like it. But that's how we did it. Okay? We dined and ate, etc. Or breakfast with them. For example is the best teacher, or how to say, yeah. When they see the thing, there are some people from that time. All boys of the very first group are still alive, and whenever I meet them, they all remember the same thing. They remember how coming here, they were welcomed as if they were at home, and that there were no separations of any kind between the staff and the students.
I started off in St. Mary's in September 1953, in fact, as a boarder. But I was very attached to my mother. So after a term there and probably being miserable, I actually was then a day scholar until possibly I was maybe even 11 or 10 or something of that nature. So I did my O-level at St. Mary's, but my mother said, okay, now you're not going to do your A-level at St. Mary's because they're not really serious enough in study. You will have to go to a school in the UK, Ampleforth or Downside, or one of these kind of Benedictine-run schools in the UK. Well, towards the time when I would have to then make a decision to go to the UK, Strathmore came into existence. That was they were talking about it in 1960. So it started off in 61, and there was good publicity for Strathmore College, as it was called then, Strathmore College of Arts and Science. And the result was that my mother said, okay, well, a possibility, instead of going to Ampleforth, was to go to Strathmore. And this is what, obviously being born in Kenya and, having grown up here, this is what I preferred to do. And that's the reason why I actually joined Strathmore in January 1963. In fact, David Sperling, who was the principal of Strathmore at that time, knew that my mother had those additional duties over the weekends and so on. So he actually went to my mother and said, look, you're going to have problems, looking after Jimmy. Not really, because at that time I'd already bought a motorbike. My one idea from when I was a very small boy was I wanted to be an engineer. So I came to Strathmore. I had basically 3 lecturers here. One was Santos Amur. He actually died in a car crash on the Naivasha Road, Nairobi Naivasha Road, in July 1963. He was teaching just a couple of us further mathematics. I then was being taught mathematics by Kevin O'Byrne, who actually was an engineer. And then I had a physics teacher, John Roach. Strathmore was very, very different from St Mary's. You know, I was a boarder at St Mary's, so we'd go there, and of course the timetable at St Mary's was that you get up at 6:15 in the morning. At the beginning of term, you know, in order to make it easy for us, that we would have a couple of weeks where, you know, we get up later, we'd have fewer classes. You know, it was a kind of pumzika attitude, really. One of the things that really impressed me about Strathmore was, you know, I would get up here at 6 o'clock in the morning, okay? But basically we would have breakfast with our members of staff, okay? They ate with us at that particular time. That was at about 20 to 8. At 10 past 8, we were in class, you know, attending lessons. At St Mary's, we used to have an assembly where we would then just saunter off to class, okay? And, you know, the classes would begin a little bit more casually. The thing that really impressed me here was, you know, from day one, you know, kazi, wachi kumpumzika kila saa, you know, let's get down to work, okay, immediately. I studied physics for 3 years in St Mary's with a Father Paddy Noonan. He was also in charge of the first 15 rugby team in St Mary's, and also he was in charge of the boxing. We used to have boxing in St Mary's as well. And he was a great fellow, but he used to smoke in class. He was a kind of, you know, chain smoker. And we never did one assignment over those 3 years. I came to Strathmore, you know, John Roach wrote on the board. We also copied. He said, okay, now, since you're not in a position where you can do any questions yet, you know, I want you to write up what we did in this class and hand it in tomorrow morning. Wow, this was totally different to what we were doing in St Mary's. The thing that really amazed me also was the fact that a lot of people would study in their own rooms, because the dormitories were organized that you'd have a room of 5 people where you have the 5 beds, and beside each of those rooms was a study table in a study room separate from it. So you could decide, you know, look, let me study, let me do whatever we want to do. But we would come out of dinner at 7:30. We'd go, some people would go over to the library, not many though, the majority of people would study in their rooms. But I tell you, there was silence in that 4-story block from 7:30. At about 10, people would go through because they'd have a problem given, and people would go around and say, well, okay, what did you find as a solution to this problem? What answer did you get? And people would compare answers. But I tell you, the study atmosphere was something absolutely phenomenal. One could excel in Strathmore very much more easily than one could do so, let's say, at one's previous school, in study especially. And, you know, I remember when I came to my A-level exam, the problem in the exam was I knew so much I could actually keep writing for 6 hours rather than for 3 hours. In one of the rooms, I remember there was a Maasai guy. Everyone was frightened of this Maasai guy because he was a hell of a strong guy, and, you know. But he was a serious student, you know. And this happened, you know, by and large with all of us here in Strathmore. We were serious. And I remember a number of years later when I was a teacher here, we had played against Lenana. I think we were beaten in rugby by Lenana. You know, as we came into the car park here, he said, let's get Lenana to the library. By this stage, our library was built here. Let's get Lenana to the library and have a new contest there, because we knew that when it came to study, we would be able to beat Lenana hands down, you know. Unfortunately, that spirit of study is not has not been retained amongst the youngsters of Kenya today. I remember actually in St. Mary's, the headmaster in my final year was Father Cunningham, who was headmaster for a number of years, and he was 44, and we had a Father Meenan who used to teach us chemistry. He was 62, I think, or something of that nature, but he was a guy who had very thick glasses and really didn't sort of know what was going on around him. When I came to Strathmore, David Sperling was 25 or whatever, I don't know. You know, you could work it out, and Silvana was the same age. Kevin O'Byrne was playing rugby with Harlequins, and he was a really good rugby player. So obviously, you know, that kind of natural respect that you have for a person, you know, was easy in some ways.
How old were the students? Some were almost as old as we were, 18, 20, 22, you know. They were all students. They were coming, especially those coming from the remote areas.
It was easier because obviously these guys were younger, you know, whereas Father Cunningham was 44, okay, David Sperling was 25, and, you know, so. But David, you realize that David was a guy who worked at a different level. You know, he was a great friend of Tom and Boyer. He was a great friend of Sagini. He knew the head of the University of Nairobi, used to play with Karanja, okay, who actually became the Kenya ambassador to London. So he was a guy who sort of moved in those circles, okay, at a very, very high level. So you realize, now wait a moment, this guy, you know, and he was just learning Swahili at that time, okay, but he you know, sometimes you'd even be embarrassed, okay, because even though he's learning Swahili, his Swahili was better than mine already, you know, and so it was a little bit embarrassing, you know, in some ways. Everyone was in awe of him, you know, because he was a young man who obviously was incredibly talented. He used to give us talks which were just, you know, incredible. And the result was that we had him, you know, we held him in very, very high respect, you know.
Well, I cannot have other than a great admiration of a fellow who renounced great possibilities in his career, because his career was diplomatic. He studied diplomacy, and he could have gone very far in life, and he decided to dedicate his life to an initiative like Strathmore.
You know, the first students, we have to go and look for them because they didn't know that Strathmore existed. What David Sperling did together with Kevin was to undertake long trips by car, usually the usual Volkswagen Beetle, to go to all remote areas, to places like Kaba, to places like Western, what's the name of the school, St. Mary's Yala, all this, to interest the students, to interview them, and above all to the headmasters, most of whom were, of course, at the time missionaries. And the missionaries, well, some missionaries understood what we were about to do, others didn't. But again, this is a normal thing. You cannot expect everybody to understand the same thing. But that's how it was done. What I found in Africa is that there is a great respect for age and for knowledge. So people don't despise you simply because you are younger than them. If you know more, they'll notice it. And the sense of loyalty is totally independent of color or anything else. It's just something that people see.